Good afternoon, this is Gary Kavanagh here on TRSI. I'm here today with my friend and colleague, Michael Dwyer. Michael, how have you been in this wonderful festival season?
I have been fantastic, Gary, and it's a beautiful, beautiful day down here in the strawberry fields, and it was a beautiful day yesterday. Not a perfect start to the electronic picnic in the Strad Valley, but they've had a lovely time of it now. Although there was a rather beautiful moment where it was the event. This event was cashless this year. Very exciting, cashless event until all the machines on site broke down, and the patrons therefore were reasonably inquiring. Well, now, did this mean they could get free stuff, like free beer and free ice creams and the things that you buy at festivals, as I understand it? And they were told, well, actually, no, you can't get free stuff. We will actually take cash now that the machines are gone. But not such great weather in the Burning Man, the great cultural event in the United States. And I don't know, Gary, about you, if you've seen the pictures. Maybe you're aware, you haven't seen any of it. But I kind of don't like the degree which I saw this, and felt a kind of a schadenfreude pleasure of, well, you couldn't happen to nicer people feel to it, which is completely wrong, because I'm sure there are many, many very lovely people, but I don't know, did you see it? It's turned into an absolute mud. It could turn into sort of Mad Max, the Thunderdome out there.
So for those who aren't aware, Burning Man is a massive American festival set in a desert in Nevada. It is kind of hard to describe, Michael. It's very popular with the tech sector. It's not quite hippie-ish, but it's not very far from it.
It's hippie geek.
Yeah, and there's burnings of effigies and things like that, and that sort of thing. It is flooded after, Michael, more than half an inch of rain.
It's a lot of rain in a very short period of time, Gary. Climate change, you know.
One thing that makes it particularly fun is I know someone who goes there every year, Michael.
Yeah.
And it's someone you would probably not expect. It's Grover Norquist, the head of Americans for Tax Reform.
Grover Norquist goes to Burning Man. Well, no, I am. Yes, I am. Well, okay, I am surprised initially, but I suppose there is a kind of that sort of Western anarchic, weird libertarian god, you know. Yeah, why not?
For the listeners who aren't aware, Grover Norquist would be considered one of the most powerful yet shadowy figures in the American right. And Michael, not only does he go to Burning Man, the problem when you meet him is it's nearly impossible to get him to stop talking about fucking Burning Man.
Really?
You meet him, and then within about 5 minutes, he's just talking about the orgy tent. And you're like, this is just a weird direction, and this guy just really loves Burning Man.
That is, that's a worry. the orgy tent, really? Ugh. Frankly, they're two words that together or separately in a sentence I just don't want to hear or use. But there you go.
Call me old-fashioned, Michael, but I prefer my orgies to be in a Roman-style villa.
I prefer them to be in a Roman villa, full stop. It doesn't have to be, I don't want it Roman style. I want it Roman, and I want it happening sometime around 45 AD. And I don't want to be within 1,000 miles of it.
And then the emperor gets annoyed, and there's a false ceiling which gives way, and then everyone gets suffocated under rose petals. The traditional way of doing things. Yeah.
Was it feathers? Heliogabalus. Anyway, go on. Yes, lots of fun things happening in the world.
So, yes, so we want to go into the Electoral Commission and some of the comments that they made. But before that, we wanted to return to something we were talking about last week. Last week, we were talking about grade inflation for the Leaving Cert. And I was saying it didn't really make a lot of sense to me, because if you inflate the grades, the courses will adjust correspondingly. So you're hurting the people at the top because you put more competition against them, but they can't inflate their grades any higher, not in any practical sense. So what is the point? Because if the courses adjust, then no one really wins here. Everyone gets more points, but the practical effect is exactly the same. And Michael has been chasing that up over the past week in order to enable him to showcase some level of ignorance on my part. So Michael, what have you found? How embarrassed should I be?
Well, we should all be perennially, I don't know, embarrassed, but we should all be ashamed. We should be ashamed just of our humanity. I think Kant or somebody like that, Kant said that. Anyway.
I've often thought that, particularly when I go away with you and I see you at a buffet, I think that's a man who should be ashamed of himself.
That is a vicious, uncalled for, and untruthful attack. I am the feckin' model of decorum when it comes to a buffet. Mr. Kavanagh, who has been known to pile up if he could get 3 or 4 T-bone steaks on the same plate and eat them with his hands, would do so. God, that's vicious savagery and unnecessary on a Sunday. Anyway, after that drive-by shooting, it's a lovely story of how somebody goes out to solve a problem, then creates another problem, and then creates a problem they actually can't find really an effective way of getting out of, because they've now created exactly the same problem that they came in to solve in the first place. Okay, let's go back to the long time ago when there was a thing called COVID. You remember COVID, Gary? Which, yeah, by the way, COVID, I don't know, is it the sequel? Or is it the second? The second trilogy is on its way soon.
We had some people in Gript who got COVID there during the week, and it just felt very retro.
Yeah, my brother got COVID last week, and which wasn't fun. And you're all hanging around waiting to see everybody's going to get it after the glorious victory of Naomh Eanna in the Senior Hurling Club Championship in Wexford, which I'm sure all the listeners will want to hear about. But you can get highlights on YouTube. We thought the whole team might go down. But anyway, last week, so we're talking about the great inflation. So I went off and talked to a number of people around the gaff. And the thing is, back in COVID days, it was decided that the Leaving Cert before COVID would have been, because it was held under non-COVID standards, would have been an easier Leaving Cert if you're going to have exactly the same course, exactly the same type of exam, and exactly the same standards of correction. Now, the thing is, so what, Gary? What is that every year a certain number of students will defer their courses. So you defer your Leaving Cert you can defer for a year, and you don't go in the same year as your Leaving Cert. You go for the following year. Now, that would mean that they would be going in with points. This is, as far as I understand it, I don't see why. Anyway, you wouldn't just get the course you got the previous year. But so because people were deferring, that they would be under an advantage, so that you had to sort of lower the floor for those students who were under the new regime, the COVID regime. Now, as early, this was recognized as an issue back in 3 years ago. So people, well, how big a problem was this? Well, in 2020, UCD decided to put, and TCD did as well, all the colleges I can't remember, but certainly I remember UCD and TCD did. And I remember that UCD put in a ceiling of a maximum of 5% of admissions would be deferrals, right? Mm-hmm. Now, Gary, I'm sure you have spotted the problem in this system is how do you get out of it? Because if you're going to create a lower standard on the basis that because of deferrals from last year would have an advantage over this year, if this year's standards were higher than last year's standards, well, Gary, throw it out there to the listeners and to yourself. What does that mean for the future going forward?
So, Michael, based on what you've told me, my immediate thought is you could have just taken the people who were going to defer, worked out what the fall in grades was in the next year during COVID, and moved their points down proportionally so they still remained where they would have been, or where you would have expected them in that COVID year. And yes, you would have had to reduce certain people's points, but as the courses are reactive, no one would have been any worse off at all. So is this the case that basically they just didn't want to lower anyone's points and decided rather than lower a small amount of people's points, it was better to bring everyone else's points up?
I think essentially, yes, that nobody said that, but I think essentially that, because the effective outcome is the same. If you raise the number of points of the people with whom you do your Leaving Cert in 2019 and you defer to 2020, right? And you had the easier leave. You had a non-COVID leaving. So you come along and they say, well, actually, we're going to bring your points down because we want to make it 11 playing field. You go, oh, but I got 520. I got 520 and now you're bringing me down to 480. That's not fair. But the thing is, as regards the CAO, as you point out correctly, Gary, it makes no practical effective difference. If you, instead of bringing that person down to 480, you bring everybody else who was at 480 up to 520. The distribution remains the same, as we said last week. The Leaving Cert is fundamentally now just a sorting system. It's a sorting mechanism for allocating places in third level colleges. So, and those results are based on the distribution connection between the application to X number of courses and the students that apply. So if 5,000 people apply for medicine and there are 500 places, well, then you pick the top 500, and that probably means the top 500 will have, in fact, 625 points. Away you go. It's not really complicated. The problem is we are now stuck with the system where this is now an infinite loop, which you could have got out of if, as you say, at the beginning you'd simply brought down the previous year's deferrals and then let this thing go. But then you would have seen stories, I'm fairly sure you would have seen stories about the disastrous decline in results or something, and maybe they wanted to avoid that. But anyway, the consequence is we're now facing that. Now, Simon Harris has come out and Simon has said that from next year we should see the removal of grade inflation, the abandonment of grade inflation, or at least official endorsed grade inflation. First of all, I think, Gary, I would point out, I like to use the word should. Next year should see it. And secondly, I don't know how you justify it. Once you've introduced this snake into the cabin, well, you're always going to have last year's. Well, if there's no grade inflation next year, that means that the people who did it this year, who defer for next year, are going to be under a significant advantage, unless, of course, they were relying on honours maths, whereby hangs a tale, because, of course, honours maths was the only subject where we saw not grade inflation, but significant deflation this year, because the paper was very, very hard. And even though they tried their very level best to correct the paper in a nice and sympathetic fashion, they couldn't get the figures up because it was just too hard.
No, I mean, on that basis, what they have done is created a scenario where they have the same problem they had during COVID every year.
Yes.
With people deferring and having an advantage from it. And what I suspect will happen eventually, Michael, is that we will just decide we're just not going to do anything about that, and we'll stop the grade inflation and just allow people to have the advantage, which arguably is something we should have just done during COVID anyway.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Bite the bullet. I think this is a classic example of identifying a problem, which was a problem, but wasn't that big a problem. And you know what? In individual cases, you could have maybe found a way of solution, but rather, instead of to solve the problem, you brought in a government program. And as we know, Gary, there's nothing as permanent as a temporary government program. You brought in a solution which is ultimately potentially going to be worse than the problem. But here's an interesting thing that came out of the discussion, Gary, about this sideways. Talking to people who are involved in, say, subjects like, say, geography or certainly English, any things requiring, say, essay answers. A number of people said to me that there was quite a few comments about the decline in literacy standards, a genuine noticeable decline over the COVID period in the literacy of the students. And I said, well, do you mean like the standard of essay writing or something? And he said, no. I mean, what rather even more concerning, because stylistic points you can tidy up and say, it was noticeable that in students' capacity to properly answer questions was impaired by their comprehension of the questions. And it wasn't just the odd one, that there were certain questions where words that they wouldn't have considered to be problematic, and indeed words which would have been used during the syllabus, during the course, were using questions, and they were obviously being consistently misunderstood by a fair tranche of students answering the question. So I think that's a worry, and I wonder if the same thing hasn't happened. When you're talking about basic skills, if the same thing maybe hasn't happened with maths, and that was something which also contributed. Although it was widely agreed that the maths paper was very hard, that also that you have had a decline. Because now, Gary, this will amaze you, because you always expect the very best of people. A number of teachers said to me, you know what, the thing about the corrections and the COVID experience was, yes, that there were some students who found it very, very difficult. There were some, and there was no doubt that was a problem. There were some who were very stressed and very anxious. There were large numbers, on the other hand, who recognised it as an opportunity to say, oh, I'm so stressed, I'm so terrible, it's awful, please treat me nice, please be nice to me. And she said, and that consequently, that there has been a significant decline in the work ethic for students who are for years who are now in the Leaving Cert cycle or doing the Leaving Cert. That simply work ethic kind of disappeared because there was an expectation that they were going to get special treatment because poor them, it was just awful. They were these young people and their lives were being destroyed by this horrible thing called COVID. They couldn't go to school and socialise, and when they were in school they had to wear masks. It was just awful. And there was simply, for good reasons or bad reasons or manipulative reasons, just a real decline in work ethic. Now, I'm sure there are other teachers out there who say this is nonsense, but I had more than one teacher say this to me.
It's almost like, Michael, you're saying that the government has introduced a new incentive into the system and the people are responding to it in a way that is negative but overall rational.
I think that could be a very close to describing precisely what's happened.
It's like when we talk about why are Irish NGOs that do advocacy so bad? Like, why does the Irish Heart Foundation do a focus group with 6 people and then launch it as national news attacking an entire sector?
Yes.
Because they can. Because the Minister for Health will turn up and the Irish Times will cover it and no one will mention that you have done basically no work. So why put the work in? Like, you're just wasting resources. And in that way, Irish NGOs are incredibly efficient, Michael.
Yeah, I wouldn't say they're bad, just wicked.
Yes, I think wicked is the appropriate way to do it. Did you see the ICCL, Michael? The balls on these people, you've got to admire it.
Yeah, much like a Hereford bull, Gary. Tell the nice people.
So, the ICCL has obviously been lobbying for the hate speech laws.
Like,
on the face of it.
Why wouldn't you? I mean, for a civil liberties organisation. Go on, yeah?
Yeah, well, you see, Michael, it's not a civil liberties organisation in general. It's the ICCL. So it is obvious that they would do this. They have been lobbying for hate speech bills to come in. They've been saying a couple of things publicly to make it sound like they have terrible concerns, but the groups associated with them have privately been pushing full steam ahead. So there's a bit of, shall we say, talking out of both sides of the face there. But in their pre-budget submission, Michael,
yes,
the other shoe drops. And they start talking about the need to fund work that supports the hate speech laws, Michael, for a very small investment of €10 million.
No, 10 million. Oh. But I suppose, you know what, Gary? Ask for 10, get 5, be happy.
I mean, we've all agreed that these laws are good things. And obviously, you know, the ICCL has done a lot of work getting it there and has displayed, Michael, subject mastery and expertise. So, of course, the next reasonable step is that respectable groups should, of course, reinforce what will be government policy, Michael. We wouldn't want government policy to fail. So it's not that those groups want millions of euros to support themselves and their friends and their little toadies. It's that it's what should happen in order to achieve the outcome and safeguard the outcome that we've all agreed should be done. So in that case, we should absolutely pour more money into these people.
And you absolutely know the kind of programs that they will do. There will be programs in support of education and outreach. So you can tell the people what hate speech is and how to avoid it. You know, I don't know, were you ever present at any of those HR seminars where where they teach you on how employees in the workplace should relate to each other, what kind of compliment it is okay for a man to give to a woman. For example, Janet, good morning. You're looking very professional today, as opposed to Janet, wow, God, that top really brings out your breasts, which will be an inappropriate thing to say. Or, God, your ass looks fantastic in those trousers, Max. So they will go out and teach us, Gary. They will tell us how to behave. Also, probably they can use the money to go out and locate the hate groups who are facilitating and spreading the hate speech, and they can monitor them, because I think it'd be very important that you should be. I can imagine that you could need 20, 30 people to do that, constantly on computers, maybe with really expensive algorithms to find out here hate words like immigrant or white or paint, and you could, and then you have to tour around the country to find these groups. There's lots of work there, Gary, and work that has to be done by somebody.
Just to give you some of what the ICCL is saying here, they're saying this needs to be done, Michael, to tackle hate crime and extreme hate speech, because they're of the view that legislation alone isn't enough to tackle the problems.
No.
And to make the legislation work, the public need to understand what hate crimes and hate speech are and how the new laws will work. And to this end, alongside the commencement of laws tackling hate crime and extreme hate speech, which I like as a line, Michael, because this is directly from the ICCL pre-budget submission. It's no longer laws against hate speech. It's laws against extreme hate speech, which has a sort of an indication to it, Michael, that, someone has run some polls and not gotten the answer they wanted. And now it's become extreme hate speech.
So the poll, would you support laws to control hate speech? No. Would you support laws to control extreme hate speech? Well, extreme hate speech, maybe, yeah.
One of the polls that McEntee's department directed me to initially when they were on this, and it said it showed a support for hate speech laws, the actual question that had been asked was, and I'm paraphrasing here, but this was the tone of it, would you like to see appropriate action taken in relation to hate crime?
Yes.
And people said yes.
That's right, yeah. I remember.
Everyone feels that crime should be tackled appropriately. The question is, what is appropriate?
God, we're still waiting, though, and I'm sure you're waiting like I am with bated breath for the research to be published. It's going to be very exciting.
Oh, well, originally the department told me that was going to be published months ago, and then the researchers told me actually it wasn't going to be published until at least September. So I was actually looking into it there the other day, Michael, to see had it come out. It hasn't yet. As soon as it does, I will be having a look at it and we'll see what happened. But on the money, Michael, the first year they want 2 million. So 500,000 for public awareness and education, and another 1.5 million on an action plan to tackle hate crime. And that is then going to go into basically an annual stipend for impacted communities.
Impacted communities?
A tiny investment, Michael, I think we can all agree, to get the ICCL and people associated with it to the standard of living that they deserve.
I wonder, will that mean that fat people will get money? I think probably there are more fat jokes than probably any other kind of hate crime joke. And speaking as a fat man, if there's money available, because as a member of an impacted community, I'm willing to fill out a short application for it.
Well, I think that you have a problem of timing here, Michael, because now with the common availability of Ozempic, being fat will soon be, much like homosexuality, a choice.
But maybe with Ozempic. Is
that one of those jokes I just have to edit out afterwards?
I don't know. I thought it was a good one. It is a thinker. But also, by the way, because it's subversive and satirical at the same time. The thing is, if it becomes, with Ozempic makes it fatness, then maybe fatness as it becomes a rarer and rarer thing, it might become cool again.
I was actually thinking that this might cause us to see a change in class views of this, whereas currently, the higher cultural and economic classes view fatness as very common.
Yes.
And basically as a failure. But as it becomes, again, a choice, do we go back to the old view where fatness is effectively a marker of high status? That could be good fun, couldn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Because, we're always looking for things. And I'm aware that in the United States, having a large booty, I believe it's called, is regarded as a sign of female pulchritude. There's a group on the television called Kardashians. I think they're Armenians. They're successful in something, I don't know what. But I've heard a lot of discussion about the size of their bottoms, and I understand that they have large bottoms. So maybe the large bottom is on its way back. A la Rubens and all those paintings, the big ladies, and maybe, and I don't understand these things, Gary. I hear them, I note them, I don't understand what they mean. I have noticed on the internet in the last 6 months more discussion of men's bottoms as well, and people going to the gym. I think it seems to be like they started on. They wanted big biceps, and then they wanted big abs, or not big abs, but whatever. They wanted abs, and then they wanted a big chest. Apparently now they want big legs, and part of that comes because with the big arm, it's all very complicated, and well, not complicated, but confusing to a person like me. So maybe, we are on the road to fashionable fatness, as opposed to body positivity, which, Jesus, lads.
So we go on to the Electoral Commission now. There's one thing actually I just wanted to touch on before that, Michael. So
yes.
We've been sending Ben Scallon to a lot of press events with the government ministers the last while, trying to get as much use out of it as we can, because we started to see situations where invites to certain events, Michael, seem to have been, should we say, people have forgotten to send them to Gript.
Oh, that's unfortunate. I'm sure an intern was sacked, Gary.
I'm sure. With a name that sounds at least moderately believable.
Yeah.
But it's been wonderful to see how ministers react to an actual question. Like a question that is perhaps not, a gotcha question, Michael, but requires you to explain yourself in a way that many of these people are not used to. And it's been interesting to see who can actually do it. So we had Simon Harris there during the week, and we had Ben ask him a question about spinal bifida. Simon Harris had previously come out and said that, no child would wait beyond a certain amount, I think it was 6 months, for treatment of spinal bifida, and that, it was a shame, but he was giving a guarantee. Obviously, that guarantee had been met. So we asked Ben to go and ask him, well, has it been met? Are you still ashamed? And do you accept responsibility even though you're out of the department? And Michael, he gave a very good, considered answer. Now,
yes.
Was it an answer that accepted full responsibility? That's a different thing. A good answer and a, should we say, very open and honest answer are not the same thing. But you compare that to the way, let's say, Minister Catherine Martin dealt with the question of what is a woman.
Oh, car crash. I think on another stage, I think it was the same in the same set of questions, but I think I saw her answer a connected question, which was, that's not relevant. In response to the proposals about a referendum which was going to remove the word woman from the Constitution in the name of equality. And what is a woman? Oh, that's not relevant. No, yeah.
So that was her opener. It's not relevant. And then when pushed was that, it hasn't been signed off on the exact wording. And you're sort of I, a simple government minister, cannot answer such a complicated question without the full apparatus of the state having told me what the correct answer is. Unfortunately, Ben did not get the follow-on question I had asked him to put in. And the way we do this, Michael, is I said, now, Ben, if she struggles, like she cannot answer the question, try and get this in as a follow-on. And it's very simple. It's, can a man give birth to a child? Because I just want to see what she does.
Well, I think I think Ben should be sent along with that anyway. I think we should, somewhere between now and Christmas, I want to hear Ben Scallon ask that. And I don't know. Is it more fun to ask it of a man or a woman with children? It's fun both ways, Go with
See,
it, whatever
the
you
problem
want.
is the ministers you really want to ask questions like that appear so infrequently before the press. Like Roderick O'Gorman does very, very little in front of the press. Our dear Minister for Education is basically entirely absent. And there's loads of stuff you want to ask them. Like I want to ask Roderick O'Gorman about the problems with with creches. There's a load of stuff happening there where negotiations seem to be on the verge of collapse. And part of it seems to be due to personal things that Roderick O'Gorman has said in these meetings to these people that they've thought were offensive and insulting. But he's never going to appear, so you don't get to ask these questions. But of the people we've talked to, the most competent in response to answering a question are Simon Harris and Darragh O'Brien. And they are, as someone who is obviously not a great fan of Simon Harris, he is far, far more competent, both in relation to answering these questions and just knowing his brief, than most of his peers. I think it's pretty obvious his leadership bid for Fine Gael is simply better than his opponents, partially because McEntee spectacularly self-imploded. That was just a wonderful failure to launch.
McEntee has effectively self-immolated. Now, I think the concatenation of circumstances around being Minister for Justice probably adds to this. But my suspicion is that however lovely a lady, or what was that Father Ted thing? No, we won't. However, I suspect that she was going to be exposed in any kind of challenging cabinet position anyway. The rest, it's right now, I don't know who you could see that would put it up to Harris. And and we were talking about the Electoral Commission, we're talking about the noise around it rather than the outcomes. But even the outcomes, I think, have created all sorts of interesting opportunities. And whether or not Fine Gael, who are up 2 points in the poll, and Fianna Fáil, who are static, can survive in rural Ireland, will make a large difference. Simon will be fine because Simon is effectively he's not effectively, he's in the pale, but he's in the part of the pale that is even sort of virtually South Dublin, culturally. So Simon won't be affected by any kind of bloodbath when the farmers come for Fine Gael with the pitchforks and the firebrands. So, say, for example, somebody like Heather Humphreys was to emerge from the pack of a certain kind of cultural, historical heritage for Fine Gael, I think that the support for her in the parliamentary party is going to be decimated, assuming that Leo stays till the next election. But yeah, he's looking right now. I think he looks nailed on.
Yeah, and to be fair to him, as I said, as someone who said many unpleasant things about Simon Harris, he's just better than a lot of his competition.
And do you know what else, Gary? He has got better. He's a lot better than he was 2 years ago, 3 years ago.
I think the interesting question is, I remember Simon Harris was years ago described to me as a shadow in the shape of a man made entirely of ambition.
Yes, I remember.
I think is generally a fair description. The question, I think, is if Harris actually gets the leadership and of the party and the country, whether or not he's actually an effective Taoiseach. Because if he decides that the thing that will actually keep me here is running the country effectively, as opposed to the current approach, which is the thing that will keep us here is doing as little as possible, and then, just hoping that's enough, he could actually be quite an effective Taoiseach. The question, of course, is effective in what way?
It's different for Leo. Leo is Taoiseach. He's going to be Taoiseach until he isn't Taoiseach. And nothing that happens, bar an actual revolution and blood on the streets, is going to affect his capacity to go around being Taoiseach. So I don't think Leo particularly gives a damn about how well or how badly he does it. I think he might care about what some of his friends think, that he was absolutely bricking it. But let's face it, you can detach yourself from it and just say to the NGOs and to the civil service, lads, you go on and run the country. Or you can even say to Micheál Martin, Micheál, could you do it this week? I don't have the feeling, I never had the feeling that Leo was particularly a party man, that he had any deep kind of emotion or sentimental attachment to Fine Gael as a party, which means that he doesn't really care about party building or what he's going to leave behind him for Fine Gael, for the next leader, and how that's going to affect the party into the future. So I think Leo's the kind of man who's got a job, but he's there for the position, not for the work. It's he wants the position, but he doesn't really care about the power, because he doesn't really want to have the responsibility that goes with it. Harris, well, we shall see. We shall see. Many a slip twixt cup and lip.
So, on the Electoral Commission, we had Ben down at the Electoral Commission. He was talking to Art O'Mahony, who is he's the managing director of the Electoral Commission, and they were asking them about how the entity can aim to regulate what is effectively truth, because the Electoral Commission is going to have broad-ranging powers in relation to misinformation and disinformation, particularly during election cycles. I think the one that caught most people's attention, was Justice Marie Baker, who is the chairperson of the Commission. And she made a couple of comments about how we will all need to become philosophers, which I know annoyed a number of people, but she's absolutely right. If you're trying to judge the truthfulness of certain statements where there's ambiguity and you're trying to decide, was that a statement of fact or is that an opinion? What is the actual line here? There's always going to be a lot of a grey zone where people basically have to just decide on a case-by-case basis, which I think is one of the strongest arguments for this sort of work not to happen, particularly in a way where the government elects people. And it's unclear, Michael, to what extent this is going to be a black box and to what extent everything is going to be open. The Commission is allowed, under the legislation that creates it, to make certain things public, but they don't have to make those things public. And we don't know which way it's going to be. But I think the other one was, she said we're going to have to learn to deal with the balance between the right to freedom of expression and the right of persons not to be misinformed.
Baffled me, genuine, not rhetorically.
I would point out, as you may have guessed from the title, that Justice Baker is on the Supreme Court.
Yes. And
so you would imagine Michael has an understanding of the Constitution above most people in the country.
He even read all of it. And I have indeed read all of it, which would probably qualify me to be a Supreme Court justice. And I went back and read it again, and I can find some kind of a free speech bit in it, but association and protests and gatherings and all sorts of yucks. What's the language again? A right to be protected from disinformation. Or misinformation.
We're going to have to learn how to deal with the balance between the right to freedom of expression on the one hand, and on the other hand, the right of persons not to be misinformed.
The right of persons not to be misinformed. And now, Gary, I think just for the maybe a subtle distinction, misinformed, not disinformed, misinformed. I honest to God, I don't know how the hell you can drag that one out of your arse. Because, okay, here, like in the United States and many other countries with written constitutions, we now have established that there is a theory of unenumerated rights. Okay, that there are rights which which we derive from our constitution, but are not explicitly present on a plain text reading of the constitution. So these are rights which are found in the penumbra of the constitution, in the shadows. So if you go into, you can find, or the court has found, a right to bodily privacy, a right to bodily integrity, and a right to privacy in the Constitution, even though those words don't appear. I don't think that even the most creative lawyer, Gary, delving into the faintest shadows of the penumbra of the Irish Constitution, could find a right to protect from misinformation. It's a bizarre notion. And if you imagine that the contest between rights, because there are always going to be situations where you have rights in conflict, but then Isaiah Berlin, we recognize that there are hierarchies of rights, that some rights are more substantial, more vital, more important to the functioning of a democracy or to the flourishing of a human being, and those rights get precedence. And if you imagine that you have two rights and you put them on a seesaw, I'm going to say, Gary, the right to freedom of expression versus the right not to be misinformed is a bit like, on one hand, putting a toddler on the seesaw on one side and putting Keen Healy on the other side. The right to free expression is such a foundational, fundamental, central right, both for human flourishing, for economic activity, by the way, because, as Moynihan pointed out, when the central thing that separated the success of the West from the failure of the communist East was the recognition of the value of the freedom of the movement of information, but also for the functioning of a democracy. I ask this neutrally, and give me your opinion, your personal Gary opinion. What does misinformation? How do you decide what is misinformation and what is simply a position or an opinion that you do not agree with? How do you make that distinction?
Well, that has always been the problem. I mean, disinformation is, in some senses, easier because disinformation is deliberately crafted to be false. It's
intentional, yeah.
Misinformation, I remember years ago when the misinformation and disinformation industry was basically just winding up and starting to get ready. And they were talking about how, this was in relation to the American election, I think it was the 2016 election. It could have been earlier, actually. And they were talking about how there was so much more misinformation on the Republican side.
Yeah.
But when I went through the list of things that they had listed as misinformation, nearly every single one was an opinion piece. And it's very, very easy to simply say, well, putting forward that opinion, like saying something like immigration is too high, is misinformation. And then you justify it by saying, well, we have this amount of capacity and we haven't hit it, ignoring the fact that what has been said is fundamentally an opinion. And that, I think, is it will be very easy to use definitions like that as a weapon. One problem I actually do have with the Electoral Commission that I don't have with most other entities is this, because they have a job to do with electoral integrity and misinformation and disinformation now, and Europe is moving in the direction of giving more and more powers to groups like the Electoral Commission. In Ireland, we tend to staff these groups largely with people who have worked in politics or government, Michael.
Yeah, or the NGO sector.
Or the NGO sector or civil society. And in a part, that's absolutely understandable because these people tend to have a degree of expertise or at least accepted expertise in this area. But if you are going to put something together to oversee politicians and the chief executive officer is the previous secretary general to the president and has worked in the houses of the Oireachtas for over 20 years and has involvements with certain political parties and would know people in them, what happens when you're asked to look at misinformation coming from political parties?
Yes.
And I'm not one of those people who think that, if you've worked in government or the Oireachtas, you shouldn't be put on boards or you shouldn't be allowed to run things like this. I think in most part, that's just the way it's going to happen because in relation to this is a very specific thing. And I'm still not quite clear what the oversight is.
I think there are all sorts of... the staffing, it seems to me, is inevitably going to be that like that. Oversight is another issue. But when it gets into the business of deciding, of becoming this arbiter of what is misinformation, I think you're getting into genuinely dangerous territory because I think you're setting yourself a task which is actually impossible. I think where a lot of people are concerned is because of our direct experience of what was going on and the kinds of discourses that happened. And I think this is where this has been driven from during the COVID period. Now, let's take masks, Gary, right? And this is not about the substantive issue, as it were, about masks, but you and I were, I would say, moderately positive about mask wearing. And I think the study that we probably felt was the most interesting that was done in time was the large-scale study done in Bangladesh. But we did talk about, we adverted to the fact that there had been studies done before the outbreak of the pandemic in Japan that had indicated that there were no significant, if any, benefits to be derived. Anyway, but just for the sake of clarity, we were pro-mask. It's going to be very interesting now to see, as it turns out, what the science tells us about how effective or ineffective the mask wearing was, and certainly outside of small, enclosed spaces. During the pandemic in Ireland and other places, if somebody went out and gave the opinion that mask wearing was absolutely ineffective and useless, and this was just part of a wider problem where people are just using this as though governments were using these things as a kind of a public virtue signaling, but in reality that the practical outcomes were negligible, and it may indeed have negative outcomes. I think that a lot, and questions regarding like people who said the vaccines were 100% effective against serious illness. They were 100% effective against fatalities. That they prevented infection. All these things that were said. And again, I certainly was. I mean, pro-vaccine, roll on the vaccine, get it, be happy. But the science and what the results now are telling us that the role of the vaccine was a little bit more nuanced than we were being told. People who were speaking about the limits of vaccines or the uses, the not uses of the masks, that would have, I am absolutely certain, was in fact labelled at the time and would continue in certain sectors today, still be labelled as misinformation. And the kind of misinformation that could actually be controlled, because it wasn't just telling you the wrong temperature of the water in the sea off Corsica, if you're going for your holidays. It was something that would affect public policy and public health. It was dangerous. It turns out that it may even have, that misinformation may have been actually correct. And I don't know how you can have something which is true and misinformation, but that kind of thing. So I don't know how you can, in real time, make a judgment call. Because isn't it, without waxing too sort of free speech liberal about it, isn't it the case, Gary, that it is precisely in situations of crisis that you need to be able to allow space for people to say slightly, maybe dangerous and radical things? Because if nobody else is saying them, what happens if they're right? What happens if you actually need those 10 or 15% cranky people to say, no, you've gone off the rails, lads, this is wrong. This is what's happening, this is the truth. And if you actually structurally silence those voices, you're doing both your democracy but the general health of your society a very serious damage. And I don't know what mechanism these people can seriously pretend to have, other than an ideological lens, to decide what is going to be misinformation and honest debate.
One of the other problems you have is that once you start engaging in this sort of work, people see that you're engaging in this sort of work, and rather than actually pushing down misinformation, it can strengthen it and weaken you. It can make you seem biased, which is why it was probably not a great idea that if this needed to be done, that the Electoral Commission, which does have other important work, should be involved in it, because this has the potential to damage them. And particularly because, Michael, as we said, there's a lot of grey space. You're going to make mistakes.
That's exactly my point. And what you're saying about the reputational damage. The problem is, if they actually get involved in this, they will get something wrong. It will then come out that they got something wrong. And this will just feed in for some people's paranoia and many people's lack of trust in the institutions. And you will have now basically tainted the rest of your activities, and in the eyes of many people, politicized it, and you will have emptied your institution, to a degree, of the authority it has to speak as a neutral arbiter on these subjects.
I mean, in Gript during the week, one of the things we were doing was going through the background of every member of the Electoral Commission on this basis. And that's not what you want. You don't want a situation where people have to look into these people so we can see who is who and what they've said and what their policy positions are, because they're going to have power over these things.
Yeah.
I mean, if you were to ask me about fact-checking, and what I think the best thing I've seen in fact-checking has been pretty much since the industry started, it would be Twitter's community notes.
Excellent.
It is
really good.
Best system I've ever seen to deal with these sort of things for a number of reasons. One, it doesn't remove the information, so people are still able to see it and see it in context. Two, there's an internal weighing system where people need to agree on things, and that means some of the community notes can sometimes be a bit off, but they correct in real time, which is about the best you're going to get with this, and shows that there is feedback if things are incorrect. And I think one of the most important points is, if you think it is unfair or you don't know how it works, you can sign up to it and you can see the internal debate in full that leads to those notes being put on things. And you can also go in and argue for or against it. Too often, I think, with organizations like this, very, very serious organizations, there is a disconnect between the result and what people can see. And that makes the mistakes you make much, much more impactful, because people can't work out what happened and they start to think maybe that was deliberate, or that could have been deliberate when it could have been a mistake. And also, you now have the behavioral psychology of an organization, particularly with very respectable people, Michael, and not speaking about these people in general, but just organizations like that tend to put a high priority on protecting their reputation, which often translates to making sure people don't realize mistakes were made.
Yes.
Which is lethal for a fact checker. Look at the Journal. Look at the Journal's reputation because of its fact checking. It's destroyed its own reputation. At least from the people I talk to who would not be in sort of the right-wing bubble, Michael, it's a joke. It's turned itself into a joke because of the way it acted. And that's the danger. And that's probably not something the Electoral Commission should be doing. And this is, again, the government's fault because they set this up this way. Anyway, after that somewhat spirited rant, we will be back next week. I must close again by saying that there are still some tickets left for the free speech event, which is being held in the RDS on September the 16th. It's, I think doors open at 12:30. We'll be out by about 5. There are some new speakers who are going to be announced during the week. I think people will be interested in those speakers, but I'll put a link below in the description of this. If you are interested, tickets are... We've actually increased the allocation of tickets, Michael, because we were kind of cutting it tight. So there are some tickets available at the minute, and I believe we can probably increase the allocation once more. But that's only an extra maybe 150 tickets. So don't wait and miss out.
Everybody should get on there, but for the time being, we'll say ta-ta, go out and enjoy the sunshine because it's a beautiful day. See you next Sunday.
All the best.